Captain Rebecca Dost Martinez had been flying combat missions for 8 years when Colonel Bradley Hawkins decided she was done. Not officially, of course. Nothing that crude would appear in her personnel file. Instead, it came wrapped in the language of career development and leadership opportunities, the kind of bureaucratic poetry that meant your flying days were numbered. The meeting happened on a Tuesday morning in Hawkins' sterile office at Bagram Air Base. Rebecca sat across from his polished desk, still wearing her flight suit. JP-8 fuel and desert dust clinging to the fabric like a second skin. She'd just returned from a close air support mission that had lasted 6 hours, threading her attend through mountain passes that would make most pilots pray. "Martinez," Hawkins began, his voice carrying that particular tone officers used when they'd already made up their minds. "I'm reassigning you to training operations, effective immediately." The words hit like a punch to the chest, but Rebecca kept her expression neutral. 8 years of military discipline had taught her to never let them see you bleed. "Sir, may I ask why?" "My last performance review was exemplary. My mission success rate is irrelevant," Hawkins cut her off, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who enjoyed wielding power. "What matters is that I need experienced pilots in training roles. The war's winding down, Martinez. We need to focus on the next generation." Rebecca knew better than to argue directly, but she couldn't let it slide completely. "Sir, with respect, there are other pilots with more instructional experience who might be better suited for. Are you questioning my judgment, Captain?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Rebecca recognized the trap. Say yes, and she'd be insubordinate. Say no, and she'd be accepting a death sentence to her combat career. She chose a third option. "No, sir. I'm simply ensuring I understand the reasoning so I can better serve in my new role." Hawkins smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Good. Report to Major Williams in training operations at 0800 tomorrow. Your combat rotation is terminated." Walking out of that office, Rebecca felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. For 8 years, she'd lived for those moments when her attend's cannon spoke thunder and carved space for ground troops who needed it. She'd earned her call sign Ghost the hard way, materializing out of mountain fog when others couldn't find the target, disappearing before the enemy knew what hit them. Now she was being shuffled off to teach simulator runs to fresh-faced pilots who'd never felt the mountain wind try to tear their wings off. That evening, she sat in the pilot's lounge, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The space was mostly empty, except for Captain Jake Morrison, one of the few pilots who'd been around long enough to remember when she'd saved his convoy in the Corangle Valley 3 years back. "Heard about the reassignment," Jake said, dropping into the chair beside her. "That's some greater bullshit, Ghost." Rebecca looked up from her coffee. "It's just the military, Jake. Orders are orders." "Come on." Jake lowered his voice. "Everyone knows what this is really about. Hawkins has been gunning for you ever since that mission in Helmand. The Helmand mission." Rebecca had disobeyed a direct order to abort when weather turned ugly, staying on station to provide cover for a SEAL team that had walked into an ambush. Her actions had saved 12 lives and earned her a commendation. It had also earned her Colonel Hawkins' permanent resentment because the abort order had come from him. "He's never forgiven you for making him look bad," Jake continued. "And now he's got the authority to do something about it." Rebecca stared out the window at the flight line, where her A-10 sat under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hangar. Even from here, she could see the ground crew performing their meticulous post-flight checks, running their hands along her wing edges like they were checking a racehorse for injuries. "Maybe it's time," she said quietly. "Maybe 8 years is enough." Jake snorted. "You don't believe that any more than I do. You've got more combat hours than half the pilots in this squadron combined. You've saved more lives than most people will meet in their entire careers. And now Hawkins wants to stick you behind a desk because his ego got bruised. The truth of it settled into Rebecca's bones like a familiar ache. She'd known this was coming ever since that day in Helmand, had seen it in the way Hawkins looked at her during briefings, the way her mission assignments gradually shifted to less critical operations. But knowing and experiencing were different creatures entirely. So, what do I do? She asked, though she suspected Jake didn't have any better answers than she did. You keep your head down, fly your training missions, and wait for an opportunity, Jake said. Men like Hawkins always overreach eventually. When they do, you want to be ready. As Rebecca walked back to her quarters that night, she passed the maintenance hangar where her A-10 waited. The ground crew had finished their checks, and the aircraft sat in the pool of light like a sleeping predator. Twin engines, shark mouth, painted on the nose, wings that looked too broad until you watched them slice through mountain air. She'd named her Vengeance after her first deployment, though she'd never told anyone why. Some things were too personal for the official record. Tomorrow she'd report to training operations. She'd smile politely at Major Williams, not at the right moments, and pretend that teaching simulator runs was what she'd trained her entire adult life to do. But tonight, she stood in the shadows of the hangar and made herself a promise. When the opportunity came, and she was certain it would come, she'd be ready. Colonel Bradley Hawkins might have won this round, but the war was far from over. And Rebecca Martinez had never learned how to surrender. The mountain wind picked up, carrying the scent of diesel fuel and distant gunpowder. Somewhere out there, men and women were fighting for ground that mattered, calling for air support that might not come fast enough. Rebecca knew that feeling intimately, the helpless wait for salvation that arrived on wings. Soon, she thought. Soon, she'd be the one bringing that salvation again. Major Patricia Williams turned out to be everything Rebecca had feared and worse. Where Colonel Hawkins wielded his authority like a blunt instrument, Williams used hers like a scalpel, precise, cutting, and designed to cause maximum damage to your sense of self-worth. Rebecca's first week in training operations felt like drowning in bureaucracy. Her days, once filled with pre-flight checks and the roar of jet engines, now consisted of reviewing training curricula, updating pilot certification records, and sitting through endless meetings about operational efficiency metrics. Martinez. Williams called out during her second Monday morning briefing. I need you to review these simulator scenarios for accuracy. Lieutenant Davis here thinks they're too aggressive for new pilots. Lieutenant Tommy Davis, fresh out of flight school, with exactly 0 combat hours, nodded eagerly. Ma'am, some of these scenarios involve flying below minimum safe altitude in mountainous terrain. I don't think we should be teaching that to students. Rebecca bit back her first 3 responses, all of which would have gotten her written up. Instead, she looked at the scenario descriptions. They were based on actual missions she'd flown, sanitized and converted into training exercises. These scenarios represent real-world conditions our pilots will face in theater, she said carefully. The altitude parameters are within acceptable limits for combat operations, but they violate peacetime training regulations, Davis pressed. Section 12.4 clearly states. Section 12.4, Rebecca interrupted, was written by people who've never had to put ordnance on target while taking ground fire. These scenarios save lives, Lieutenant. Williams leaned back in her chair, studying Rebecca with the expression of a cat watching a cornered mouse. Captain Martinez, I think you're having trouble adjusting to the training environment. Perhaps. You've been in combat too long to think clearly about safety protocols. The room went silent. Every pilot in the briefing room knew what Williams had just done. Questioned. Rebecca's judgment and competency in front of junior officers. It was a calculated insult designed to establish dominance. "Ma'am," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "I believe my 8 years of combat experience and 0 training accidents speak to my commitment to both safety and effectiveness. Your combat experience is exactly what I'm worried about," Williams shot back. "Combat pilots develop bad habits. My job is to break those habits before they get training pilots killed." Rebecca felt every eye in the room on her. Several of the junior pilots looked uncomfortable, but none of them would speak up. They couldn't afford to cross Williams any more than Rebecca could. "Understood, ma'am. I'll revise the scenarios." "See that you do. And Martinez, in the future, remember that peacetime training has different priorities than combat operations. We're not trying to create cowboys here." Cowboys. The word hit like a slap. Rebecca had heard it before, usually from desk pilots who'd never felt the earth shake under enemy artillery. It was what they called pilots who took risks, who pushed boundaries, who did whatever it took to bring people home alive. After the briefing, Rebecca retreated to her assigned desk in the corner of the training office. Her new workspace consisted of a computer terminal, a stack of training manuals, and a small window that offered a partial view of the flight line. She could see A-10s taking off for actual missions while she sat trapped behind a desk, editing simulator scenarios to make them safer. Captain Lisa Rodriguez found her there an hour later, staring at the computer screen without really seeing it. "Rough morning?" Lisa asked. She was one of the few pilots who'd served with Rebecca on previous deployments and one of the fewer still who wasn't afraid to show it. "Williams thinks I'm a cowboy," Rebecca said without looking up. "Williams thinks anyone who's actually been shot at is a cowboy," Lisa replied, settling into the chair beside Rebecca's desk. "She's been in training operations for 6 years. Never deployed, never fired her weapons in anger. But somehow she's the expert on how combat pilots should think." Rebecca finally looked up. Jake said Hawkins always overreaches. I'm starting to think he was being optimistic. Maybe. But Williams is making enemies. Fast. You hear about what she did to Captain Torres last week? Rebecca shook her head. Grounded him for aggressive flying tendencies after he performed a low-level gun run during a training exercise. A gun run that was specifically called for in the scenario. When Torres pointed out that the scenario required it, she wrote him up for insubordination. The pattern was becoming clear. Williams wasn't just incompetent. She was systematically targeting combat pilots, using her authority to punish anyone who didn't conform to her vision of proper military aviation. And with Hawkins backing her up, there was no one to appeal to. She's building a case, Rebecca realized, against all of us. Make us look unstable, unreliable. Create a paper trail that justifies keeping combat veterans out of combat roles. Lisa nodded grimly. And the scary part? It's working. 3 combat pilots have requested transfers out of this squadron in the past month. 2 more are talking about it. Rebecca stared out the window as another A-10 climbed into the afternoon sky, carrying ordnance towards some distant target where people on the ground were counting on precision and courage. People like the SEAL team she'd saved in Helmand or the convoy Jake had been part of in Koringal. What would you do? She asked. Lisa was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, I'd start documenting everything. Every meeting, every assignment, every time Williams says something that contradicts actual combat doctrine. Because eventually, someone's going to ask questions. And when they do, you want to have answers. That evening, Rebecca sat in her quarters with a notebook, writing down everything she could remember from the past 2 weeks. Williams' comments about combat habits, her systematic revision of proven training scenarios, Her obvious bias against pilots with actual combat experience thought it felt like a small rebellion, but it was something. And as she wrote, Rebecca found herself thinking about her A-10 sitting in the hangar, weapons pylons empty, waiting for a mission that might never come. But patience, she reminded herself, was just another kind of weapon. And she'd learned to be very good with weapons. The call came at 0300 on a Thursday morning, cutting through Rebecca's sleep like an air raid siren. She rolled over and grabbed her phone, muscle memory from years of emergency scrambles, taking over before her conscious mind fully engaged. "Ghost, you there?" The voice belonged to Captain Morrison, but it carried an edge she'd never heard before. "I'm here, Jake. What's wrong?" "Ridge 77. SEAL team in contact. Heavy casualties. They need close air support, but the weather's complete shit. Visibility near zero, winds gusting to 40 knots. Everyone on the current rotation is weather grounded." Rebecca sat up, instantly alert. Ridge 77 was a strategic position overlooking 3 key supply routes. If the SEALs lost it, the entire operational area would be compromised. What about Hawkins? Williams? Surely they're not grounding everyone. Jake's bitter laugh carried clearly through the phone. "Hawkins is at a conference in Qatar. Won't be back for 3 days. Williams is evaluating the tactical situation and won't authorize any flights until conditions improve. People are dying, Jake. I know. That's why I'm calling you." Rebecca's blood turned to ice water. "I'm not on the flight roster." Williams made that very clear. "You're still current on combat status. Your medical hasn't expired. And your A-10 is loaded and ready. I made sure of that myself." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Jake was asking her to disobey direct orders to take an unauthorized aircraft into combat conditions that had grounded every other pilot on base. If she got caught, when she got caught, it would mean court-martial, discharge, possibly prison. "Jake, I can't. They've got 12 guys pinned down on a ridge the size of a football field. Enemy on 3 sides, no cover, and the fog is so thick they can't even see each other. The ground controller is asking for anyone at all, who can thread the needle." Rebecca closed her eyes and saw faces. The SEAL team leader who'd bought her coffee after the Helmand mission. The young corpsman who'd shown her pictures of his newborn daughter. Men with families, with futures, with everything to live for. What's Williams' position? She's locked down in operations, reviewing safety protocols. Word is she won't even authorize a reconnaissance flight until morning. And by morning? By morning, there won't be anyone left to save. Rebecca was already pulling on her flight suit. Decision made in the space between heartbeats. "Where's my bird?" "Hangar 3. I've got the ground crew standing by, but Ghost, if you do this, there's no going back. Williams will crucify you. Hawkins will make sure you never fly again." "Jake," Rebecca said, lacing up her boots, "I didn't become a pilot to keep my job. I became a pilot to save lives." 20 minutes later, she stood in front of her A-10 in the pre-dawn darkness. The ground crew had worked miracles. Fuel topped off, ordnance loaded, systems checked and double-checked. Master Sergeant Kevin Walsh, the crew chief who'd maintained her aircraft for 3 years, handed her the pre-flight checklist. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "officially, I never saw you tonight. Unofficially, bring our boys home." The pre-flight check revealed what she already knew. Her aircraft was perfect. The crew had loaded her with a full complement of Maverick missiles, Hydra rocket pods, and enough 30mm ammunition to level a small town. More importantly, they'd loaded her with something that couldn't be quantified on any checklist. The absolute trust of men who knew what she could do with the tools they'd given her. As she strapped into the cockpit, Rebecca's hands moved through the startup sequence with automatic precision. Switch positions, engine parameters, weapon systems, all of it flowing together like a practice symphony. The twin engines spooled up with their familiar growl, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like herself again. The radio crackled with the ground controller's voice. Any station. This is Overlord 7. We have troops in contact at grid November-Victor-7-4-5. Immediate close air support requested. Weather is below minimums. Repeat, weather is below minimums. Rebecca keyed her. Microphone. Overlord 7, this is Ghost Hog. I'm 2 minutes out from your position. The silence that followed lasted several heartbeats before the controller's voice came back, thick with relief and disbelief. Ghost Hog, say again? I show no authorized aircraft in the area. Overlord 7, I'm not authorized for anything except bringing your boys home. Stand by for contact. As she lifted off into the mountain darkness, Rebecca knew that Major Williams was probably asleep in her warm quarters, dreaming of regulations and safety margins. In a few hours, Williams would wake up to find that one of her problem pilots had stolen an aircraft and flown an unauthorized combat mission. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, there were 12 men trapped on a ridge who needed someone willing to fly through hell to reach them. Rebecca banked toward the mountains, her A-10's wings cutting through the darkness like a promise being kept. Behind her, the base grew smaller and more distant. Ahead, the ridge waited in a cocoon of fog and enemy fire. She'd made her choice. Now came the hard part, living long enough for it to matter. The radio chatter in her ears painted a picture no training manual could prepare you for. Calm voices reporting casualties, ammunition counts, tactical positions, all delivered with the steady professionalism of men who knew they were probably going to die, but were determined to make it expensive for the enemy. Ghost Hog came. The ground controller's voice. Be advised, visibility is 00. Winds gusting 40 knots. Multiple SAM sites active in the area. Are you sure about this? Rebecca looked ahead into the wall of fog that had swallowed the mountains whole. Her instruments glowed steadily in the cockpit, showing her a world she couldn't see with her eyes. Somewhere in that white maze, men were fighting for their lives. Overlord 7, she replied. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The mission was textbook perfect, which made what happened afterward even more devastating. Rebecca had threaded her A-10 through mountain fog thick enough to stop radar, found the pin SEAL team using nothing but thermal imaging and the sound of gunfire, and delivered precision strikes that broke the enemy position in under 10 minutes. 12 men walked off that ridge who shouldn't have survived the night. But when she landed back at base as the sun was rising, Major Williams was waiting on the tarmac with 2 military police officers and expression that could have frozen. Jet fuel. Captain Martinez, Williams said as Rebecca climbed down from her cockpit. You are under arrest for theft of military property, unauthorized use of a combat aircraft, and disobeying direct orders. The military police read her rights while her ground crew watched in stony silence. Master Sergeant Walsh looked like he wanted to say something, but Rebecca caught his eye and shook her head slightly. No point in dragging good people down with her. The next 72 hours were a blur of interrogations, paperwork, and isolation. Rebecca was confined to quarters, pending a formal investigation, stripped of her flight status, and informed that court-martial proceedings would begin within the week. Colonel Hawkins returned from Qatar with the righteous fury of a man whose authority had been publicly challenged. He stormed into the interrogation room where Rebecca sat across from a military lawyer who looked barely old enough to drive. 8 years, Hawkins said, not bothering to sit down. 8 years of exemplary service, and you throw it all away. For what? A moment of grandstanding? Rebecca met his gaze steadily. I saved 12 lives, sir. You stole a $40 million aircraft and flew an unauthorized combat mission in violation of direct orders. The lives you saved could have been rescued by authorized personnel once weather conditions improved. Sir, with respect, the SEAL team was taking casualties every minute. They wouldn't have lost it until morning. Hawkins slammed his hand on the table. That was not your decision to make. You are a captain in the United States Air Force, not some lone wolf vigilante. You have a chain of command for a reason. The lawyer beside Rebecca cleared his throat. Colonel, perhaps we should focus on the facts of the case rather than the facts. Hawkins interrupted. That Captain Martinez has consistently demonstrated an inability to follow orders and respect authority. This incident is simply the culmination of a pattern of reckless behavior that has been documented over the past several months. Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. What pattern, sir? Williams stepped forward with a thick folder. Multiple instances of questioning training protocols, argumentative behavior during briefings, and resistance to proper military procedures. All documented, all witnessed, all indicative of an officer who has lost the discipline necessary for military service. Looking at that folder, Rebecca realized she'd been played. Every interaction with Williams, every meeting where she'd tried to defend combat-proven tactics, every moment she'd pushed back against training protocols that endangered pilots. It had all been documented, twisted, and presented as evidence of instability. They'd been building a case against her for months, waiting for her to make exactly the kind of choice she'd made. The SEAL team on the ridge had been the bait, and she'd taken it completely. Her lawyer requested time to review the evidence, and Rebecca was escorted back to her quarters under armed guard. But that evening, as she sat staring at the bare walls of her room, she heard a soft knock at her window. Captain Rodriguez was outside, staying in the shadows to avoid the MP stationed at Rebecca's door. "I can't stay long," Lisa whispered through the glass. "But there are things you need to know." "Such as?" Jake's been asking questions. Turns out Williams has been falsifying training records. Several of the safety violations she's documented never actually happened, and the scenarios you were ordered to revise. She's been selling the original versions to a private military contractor. Rebecca felt the first spark of hope she'd experienced in days. "Can you prove it?" "Jake's working on it." "But Rebecca, there's more. The SEAL team you saved? Their commander is asking questions about why authorized air support was denied. Apparently, someone told him that no aircraft were available due to weather, but the maintenance logs show 3 fully operational A-10s that could have flown the mission. Williams lied to the ground commander. Worse, she actively prevented other pilots from responding to the call for help. Jake has recordings. Rebecca's mind raced. If Williams had deliberately prevented the rescue mission, then Rebecca's unauthorized flight wasn't just heroism. It was the only thing standing between 12 men and certain death. What do I need to do? Document everything. Every conversation, every meeting, every order. Jake's gathering evidence from the maintenance crews and other pilots, but we need your side of the story, with dates and witnesses. That night, Rebecca wrote. She filled page after page with detailed accounts of her interactions with Williams and Hawkins, the systematic targeting of combat pilots, the revision of training protocols that put student pilots at risk. She wrote about the culture of fear Williams had created, where experienced pilots were afraid to speak up about dangerous practices. Most importantly, she wrote about the night of the Ridge mission, the desperate radio calls, the knowledge that men were dying while authorized aircraft sat grounded for political reasons, the choice between following orders and saving lives. As dawn broke over the airbase, Rebecca finished her account and sealed it in an envelope. She'd made her choice that night on the Ridge, knowing it would probably end her career. But now, For the first time, she was starting to believe that sometimes the right choice was worth the consequences. Outside her window, she could see her. A 10 sitting in the hangar, wings folded, weapons pylons empty. But not forgotten. Never forgotten. The mountain wind was picking up, carrying the scent of distant storms. Change was coming, and Rebecca intended to be ready for it. Captain Jake Morrison appeared at Rebecca's court-martial hearing, carrying a folder thick enough to stop bullets and an expression that made the military prosecutors visibly nervous. The hearing was supposed to be a formality. Williams had testified about Rebecca's pattern of insubordination. Hawkins had spoken about the breakdown of military discipline, and the prosecutor had painted a picture of a rogue pilot whose combat experience had made her unsuitable for peacetime service. But when Jake was called as a character witness, everything changed. "Your Honor," Jake began, addressing the military judge, "I request permission to present evidence relevant to the charges against Captain Martinez." The prosecutor objected immediately. "Your Honor, Captain Morrison is here to speak to the defendants. Character, not to relitigate the facts of the case." Jake's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm here to present facts that directly contradict the testimony given by Major Williams regarding the events of that night." The judge, Colonel Angela Foster, studied Jake with the expression of someone who'd seen enough military politics to recognize the smell of cover-up. "Proceed, Captain Morrison." Jake opened his folder and pulled out a stack of audio recordings. "Your Honor, these are copies of all radio communications from the night in question, including conversations between ground controllers, flight operations, and Major Williams' office." The first recording played Williams' voice clearly denying. "Air support to the pinned SEAL team. Negative, Overlord 7. No aircraft are available for tasking due to weather conditions. Maintain position and wait for conditions to improve." But the second recording, timestamped just minutes later, captured Williams speaking to another controller. "Under no circumstances are any aircraft to be launched tonight. I don't care what's happening on that ridge. We wait for daylight and proper weather conditions." The courtroom went dead silent. Rebecca watched Williams' face drain of color as her own words condemned her. Jake wasn't finished. "Your Honor, this next recording is from the maintenance chief, confirming that 3 A-10s were fully operational and available for immediate launch that night." The voice of Master Sergeant Walsh filled the courtroom. "Operations, this is maintenance control. I have 3 birds ready for immediate tasking. Weather's ugly, but nothing these aircraft can't handle with the right pilot." The prosecutor was scrambling. "Your Honor, even if Major Williams made an error in judgment, that doesn't excuse Captain Martinez's theft of military property." "Actually," Jake interrupted, "according to Air Force Regulation 34-12, any pilot may assume command of an available aircraft during combat emergencies when human lives are at immediate risk." Captain Martinez's actions were not only legal, they were mandated by military law. Jake produced a copy of the regulation, highlighted and annotated. Rebecca's lawyer, who had seemed overwhelmed by the proceedings, suddenly straightened up as he realized what Jake had done. "Furthermore," Jake continued, "I have testimony from the SEAL team commander, Lieutenant Colonel David Anderson, who confirms that his men were taking casualties every 15 minutes and would not have survived until morning without immediate air support." The SEAL commander himself stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor, Captain Martinez saved 12 of my men that night. Every minute that air support was delayed cost us blood. If she hadn't acted when she did, we'd be having 12 memorial services instead of 1 court-martial." The tide in the courtroom had shifted so completely that Rebecca could feel it like a physical force. The judge looked from Williams to Hawkins to the prosecutor with an expression that suggested someone was going to have a very bad day. "Major Williams," Colonel Foster said, Did you specifically order that no aircraft be launched to support troops in contact? Williams stood slowly, her face pale but her voice still carrying that familiar edge of authority. Your Honor, I made a tactical decision based on weather conditions and safety protocols. The risk to aircrew, Major Williams, the judge interrupted. I asked a yes or no question. Did you order that no aircraft be launched? Yes, ma'am, but... And were you aware that troops were taking casualties while you maintained this order? Williams hesitated just long enough for everyone in the room to understand what her answer would be. Yes, ma'am. The judge turned to Colonel Hawkins. Colonel, were you aware of Major Williams' order to ground all aircraft? Hawkins looked like a man watching his career implode in real time. Your Honor, I was not present at the base that night. I was attending a conference in Qatar, but you supported Major Williams' decision to court-martial Captain Martinez for unauthorized use of an aircraft. Based on the information I was given, yes. Jake stood up again. Your Honor, I have documentation showing that Colonel Hawkins was briefed on the full details of the mission, including the fact that authorized air support had been deliberately denied before he ordered Captain Martinez's arrest. The folder Jake carried seemed bottomless. He produced email chains, phone logs, and witness statements that painted a picture of a deliberate cover-up designed to protect Williams and Hawkins at Rebecca's expense. The prosecutor made one last desperate attempt. Your Honor, regardless of the circumstances, Captain Martinez still violated the chain of command. Captain Martinez, Colonel Foster said, turning to Rebecca, saved 12 American servicemen while other officers deliberate prevented their rescue. If that's what this Air Force calls insubordination, then we need more of it. The judge's gavel came down with the finality of thunder. All charges against Captain Martinez are dismissed. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the conduct of Major Williams and Colonel Hawkins regarding their handling of this incident. As the courtroom erupted in chaos, Rebecca felt Jake's hand on her shoulder. Welcome back to flight status, Ghost, he said with a grin. Your bird's been waiting for you. Through the confusion of shouting reporters and angry officers, Rebecca caught sight of Williams pushing through the crowd toward the exit. For just a moment, their eyes met, and Rebecca saw something in Williams' expression that might have been fear. The war wasn't over yet. But today, the good guys had won a crucial battle. 3 days after her exoneration, Rebecca stood in the briefing room that had once felt like a prison, watching Major Williams pack her desk under the supervision of 2 military police officers. The investigation that followed. Rebecca's court-martial had moved with the swift efficiency of military justice when it actually functioned correctly. Within 48 hours, investigators had uncovered a web of misconduct that reached far beyond a single denied air support mission. Williams had been falsifying training records for over a year, documenting safety violations that never occurred, while suppressing reports of actual dangerous incidents that reflected poorly on her leadership. She'd been selling revised training scenarios to Blackwater defense contractors, scenarios that had been classified and developed with taxpayer dollars. Most damning of all, the investigation revealed that Williams had systematically targeted combat veterans for harassment and forced transfers, apparently believing the pilots with actual combat experience posed a threat to her authority. Colonel Hawkins hadn't fared much better. His attempt to cover up Williams' actions and his support for her false testimony at Rebecca's court-martial had earned him a reassignment to a desk job at the Pentagon. Military speak for a career over, but we'll let you retire quietly. The new squadron commander, Colonel Jennifer Hayes, had combat experience in 3 theaters and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that came from actually knowing what she was talking about. Her first official act had been to restore all the combat veterans Williams had forced out. including Captain Torres and the others who'd requested transfers. Her second act had been to summon Rebecca to her office. "Captain Martinez, Colonel," Hayes had said, "I've reviewed your entire file, including the classified after-action reports from your combat missions. Your record is exemplary, and frankly, this squadron is lucky to have you." Rebecca had sat across from Hayes' desk, still adjusting to the idea that her commanding officer was speaking to her with respect rather than contempt. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm ready to return to full flight status." "About that," Hayes smiled, "I'm not assigning you back to training operations. I'm putting you on immediate deployment status. There's a situation developing in the mountains that requires a pilot with your particular skills." Now, as Rebecca watched Williams clear out her desk, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Satisfaction, certainly. Justice had been served. But also something like pity for a woman whose need for control had ultimately destroyed everything she'd tried to build. Williams looked up as she passed, their eyes meeting for the first time since the court-martial. For a moment, neither woman spoke. "You think you've won," Williams said quietly, her voice lacking its former edge of authority. "I think 12 men went home to their families," Rebecca replied. "That's the only victory that matters." Williams hefted her box of personal belongings and walked toward the door, flanked by the MPs. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. "You know this won't end it, don't you? There are others like me, others who understand that the military can't function when pilots think they can pick and choose which orders to follow." Rebecca considered that for a moment. "Maybe, but there are also others like Colonel Hayes, others who understand that sometimes the right order is the one that saves lives, regardless of what the regulations say." After Williams left, Rebecca stood alone in the training office that had been her prison for 3 weeks. The computer terminals were still there, the stacks of regulations and safety manuals, the small window that offered a partial view of the flight line. But everything had changed. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Williams had cultivated was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. Captain Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, grinning. "So, ready to get back to real flying?" "More than ready," Rebecca said. "What's this mountain situation Hayes mentioned?" Lisa's expression grew serious. "Intelligence reports suggest enemy forces are massing in the northern ridges. Special operations? Teams are going in to gather reconnaissance, but they're going to need close air support from someone who knows how to fly in that terrain." Rebecca felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a real mission. "When do we deploy?" "Tomorrow morning." "And Ghost?" Lisa's grin returned. "Your lead pilot. Hayes specifically requested you for mission commander." That evening, Rebecca sat in the pilot's lounge with Jake and several other pilots who'd survived Williams' reign of terror. The atmosphere was celebratory, but underneath the jokes and stories, Rebecca could sense something deeper, a renewed sense of purpose that had been missing for months. "You know what the best part is?" Jake said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. "Williams spent so much time trying to prove that combat pilots are unstable, but she forgot the most important thing about us." "Which is?" Captain Torres asked. He'd returned to the squadron that morning, his force transfer reversed by Colonel Hayes' first wave of personnel changes. "We're really good at what we do," Jake replied. "And when people need saving, we don't ask permission." Rebecca smiled, but part of her mind was already focused on tomorrow's mission briefing. The northern ridges were brutal terrain, all knife-edge peaks and narrow valleys where the weather could turn deadly without warning. It was exactly the kind of environment where Williams' safety-first approach would get people killed. But it was also the kind of place where Rebecca felt most at home. The mission briefing came at 0500. Delivered by Colonel Hayes herself in the secure briefing room. Intelligence photos showed a series of ridges that looked like broken teeth against the dawn sky, with red circles marking suspected enemy positions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, "we have credible intelligence that hostile forces are establishing a major weapons cache in the northern mountain region. A SEAL reconnaissance team was inserted yesterday to confirm the location and assess the threat level." She clicked to the next slide, showing a topographical map that made Rebecca's stomach clench with recognition. Ridge 77 was highlighted in yellow, the same ridge where she'd saved 12 men 3 weeks ago. At 02:30 this morning, the SEAL team went silent. Last communication indicated they were under heavy fire and requesting immediate extraction. Weather conditions are marginal, with fog and high winds expected to worsen throughout the day. Rebecca studied the terrain features, her mind automatically calculating approach angles and weapons employment zones. The ridge system was a maze of peaks and valleys, with limited visibility and multiple threats. It would require the kind of precision flying that Williams had spent months trying to train out of her pilots. "Captain Martinez," Hayes continued, "you'll be mission commander. Your experience in this terrain makes you the logical choice to lead the rescue operation." As the briefing continued, Rebecca became aware of movement in the back of the room. Major Williams stood just inside the doorway, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a small suitcase. She'd apparently come to watch the briefing before leaving the base permanently. Hayes noticed her too. "Major Williams, this is a classified briefing. You no longer have clearance to—" "I'm not here to interfere," Williams interrupted. "I just wanted to observe how Captain Martinez handles mission planning when lives are actually at stake." The room went silent. Rebecca felt every eye on her, waiting to see how she'd respond to this final provocation. Williams was trying to rattle her, to suggest that her previous success had been luck rather than skill. Rebecca stood slowly, her voice calm and professional. "Major Williams, I understand you have concerns about my decision-making process. Would you like to review the mission parameters and offer your professional assessment?" Williams stepped forward, clearly not expecting Rebecca to invite her criticism. "I think this mission is unnecessarily risky. The weather conditions alone should delay any rescue attempt until when?" Rebecca interrupted. "Until the SEAL team is dead? Until the enemy has time to reinforce their positions? Until the weather gets worse instead of better?" Williams' face flushed. "Until proper planning can ensure the safety of our aircrew. You're talking about flying into a mountain valley with zero visibility, high winds, and known SAM threats. It's suicide." Rebecca walked to the mission board and picked up a marker. In swift, sure strokes, she drew the approach route she'd been visualizing since the briefing began. Low-level ingress through Valley 4 Alpha using terrain masking to avoid SAM sites. Thermal imaging to locate the SEAL team position. Precision strikes on enemy positions using Maverick missiles and 30mm cannon. High-speed egress through Valley 4 Bravo. She turned back to Williams. "Risky? Yes. Suicide? No. The difference is skill, training, and experience. 3 things you never valued as much as you should have." Williams stared at the tactical diagram Rebecca had drawn. Despite her animosity, she was still a pilot, and she could see the elegance of the approach Rebecca had outlined. "And if the weather deteriorates during the mission?" Rebecca smiled. "Then I adapt. That's what combat pilots do, Major Williams. We don't wait for perfect conditions. We make do with what we have and bring people home." Colonel Hayes stepped forward. "Major Williams, your concerns are noted. However, Captain Martinez is mission commander, and this briefing is classified. I'll have to ask you to leave." As Williams walked toward the door, she paused beside Rebecca's chair. "You think you're a hero," she said quietly, meant only for Rebecca's ears. "But heroes get people killed when their luck runs out." Rebecca looked up at her former tormentor. "Major Williams," Heroes don't rely on luck. They rely on skill, preparation, and the willingness to do what needs to be done. That's something you never understood. Williams left without another word, and the briefing continued. But Rebecca could feel the weight of her pardon shot. Because Williams wasn't entirely wrong. Luck played a role in combat flying, and everyone's luck eventually ran out. The question was whether her skills would be enough. When that moment came, 2 hours later, Rebecca stood beside her at 10 in the pre-dawn darkness, running through her final checks. The weather reports had worsened since the briefing. Visibility down to less than half a mile, winds gusting to 50 knots, and storm clouds building over the mountain peaks. It was exactly the kind of day when a smart pilot would stay on the ground and wait for better conditions. But 12 miles away, a SEAL team was fighting for their lives in the same mountains where she'd proven that sometimes the impossible was just another word for necessary. Master Sergeant Walsh handed her the final systems check. "She's ready, Captain. Bring our boys home." Rebecca climbed into her cockpit and began the startup sequence. In a few minutes, she'd be airborne, threading her way through mountain peaks shrouded in fog and defended by people who wanted her dead. Williams had called it suicide. Rebecca preferred to think of it as Tuesday morning. The engines spooled up with their familiar growl, and Ghost Hog prepared to disappear into the mountains one more time. The ridge materialized out of the fog like a recurring nightmare. But this time Rebecca was ready for it. She'd been flying for 2 hours through weather that would have grounded commercial aviation for a week, threading her at 10 between mountain peaks with less than 100 feet of clearance on either side. The thermal imaging showed the SEAL team's position, a tiny cluster of heat signatures pressed against the northern face of Ridge 77, exactly where she'd found the last team 3 weeks ago. The enemy had learned from their previous defeat. This time, they'd positioned SAM sites on the surrounding peaks and established overlapping fields of fire that turned the entire valley into a killing zone. A conventional approach would have been suicide, but Rebecca had stopped believing in conventional approaches years ago. She came in from the east, using a knife-edge ridge to mask her approach until she was less than a mile from the target. The first SAM site never saw her coming. She put 2 Maverick missiles into it before the operators knew they were under attack. The second site got a warning, but warnings didn't help when you were facing a pilot who'd learned to fly in valleys like this one. Rebecca dropped her at 10 into a canyon so narrow her wingtips almost scraped the walls, popped up behind the SAM site, and silenced it with a burst from her 30mm cannon that left the infantry positions on the ridge itself, and for that, she needed to get close. "Overlord 7, this is Ghost Hog," she called on the radio. "I have visual on your position. Mark your northern perimeter with smoke." "Ghost Hog, be advised, we're danger close on all sides. Enemy positions within 20 meters of our location." Rebecca smiled grimly. Danger close was where she did her best work. She lined up for her first gun run, the Go-8 cannon loaded and ready. Through her targeting pod, she could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions carved into the rock face. The SEAL team was trapped in a depression no larger than a basketball court, surrounded on 3 sides by fighters who had every advantage. Except air support. Rebecca squeezed the trigger, and her cannon spoke thunder. The 30mm rounds chewed through rock and flesh with equal efficiency, turning fortified positions into craters and silencing the weapons that had pinned the SEAL team for over 6 hours. She banked hard left, came around for a second pass, and put another burst into the southern flank. "Ghost Hog, this is Overlord 7. You are cleared hot on all remaining targets. We're moving to extract LZ now." Rebecca watched through her targeting pod as the SEAL team began their fighting withdrawal from the ridge. They moved like professionals, covering each other's advance, but she could see they were down to their last magazines. She made 3 more gun runs, each one precisely calculated to clear the route to the extraction landing zone without endangering the men she was trying to save. On her final pass, she saw the rescue helicopter rising up from the valley floor, its rotors churning the fog into swirling patterns. Ghost Hog, this is Rescue 16. We have all souls on board. Thanks for keeping the bad guys honest. Rebecca pulled her A-10 into a climbing turn, watching the helicopter disappear into the fog with its precious cargo. Another successful mission. Another group of Americans heading home to their families. But as she turned toward base, her radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. Ghost Hog, this is Overlord Actual. The voice belonged to General Patricia Stone, the theater commander. Report to my office immediately upon landing. Priority 1. Rebecca's stomach dropped. Generals didn't call individual pilots for congratulations. Someone was in trouble, and given her recent history, that someone was probably her dot an hour later. She stood at attention in General Stone's office, still wearing her flight suit and smelling of jet fuel and mountain air. The general was a small woman with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that could silence a room full of colonels. Captain Martinez, Stone began, I've been reviewing the circumstances surrounding your recent court-martial and subsequent vindication. I've also been briefed on today's rescue mission. Rebecca waited for the axe to fall. Despite her exoneration, she'd still technically stolen an aircraft and flown unauthorized missions. Generals tended to take a dim view of that kind of initiative. I want you to know, Stone continued, that your actions 3 weeks ago and again today represent exactly the kind of leadership and courage this Air Force needs. You saved 24 lives in total, and you did it by making the hard choices that other officers were unwilling or unable to make. Rebecca blinked, certain she'd misheard. Ma'am, I'm promoting you to Major, effective immediately. I'm also recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions on both missions. I'm personally ensuring that officers like Major Williams and Colonel Hawkins never have the opportunity to waste talent like yours again. The general stood and extended her hand. Major Martinez, welcome to the ranks of officers who understand that sometimes the most important orders are the ones you give yourself. As Rebecca shook the general's hand, she thought about Williams' parting words about heroes and luck. Maybe Williams had been right about luck running out eventually, but she'd been wrong about heroes. Heroes weren't people who never failed or never made mistakes. Heroes were people who understood that some things were worth risking everything for, and who had the courage to act on that understanding when it mattered most. 3 months later, Major Rebecca Martinez stood in the briefing room that had once been her prison, now addressing a new class of combat pilots. The students looked young and eager, fresh from training and ready to take on the world. Flying in combat, she told them, isn't about following a checklist or memorizing regulations. It's about understanding that every mission matters to someone, somewhere who's counting on you to make the right choice when everything goes wrong. She paused, looking out the window at the flight line where A-10s were being prepared for the day's missions. Your job isn't to be safe. Your job is to bring people home. Sometimes those two things are the same. Sometimes they're not. When they're not, you'll have to choose. Make sure you choose correctly. After the briefing, she walked out to the tarmac, where her A-10 waited, freshly painted with her new rank insignia and a small addition to the nose art, 12 small hash marks representing the lives she'd saved. Ghost Hog was scheduled for another mountain mission in an hour. Another opportunity to disappear into the fog and emerge where people needed her most. Rebecca smiled as she began her pre-flight check. Some things never changed, and she was grateful for that dot the mountains were calling, and Ghost Hog was ready to answer. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.